Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Daniel McAdams is with me this morning. Good to see you, Daniel.
Good Monday morning, Dr. Paul.
Very good. Guess what? We want to talk about foreign policy.
That's a shock.
Very important issue. Not that the economic policies aren't very important, because I think there's something big is brewing there as well. But I want to follow up on, the most famous politician of the moment, and that is Mr. Trump. And he knows something about finances, but I'm just wondering how much he knows about foreign policy. Because the question is whether or not ISIS is winning, and obviously he says it is, and he has a plan. But as usual, it's not, a modest plan. It's very simple. Go get them, invade them, send in the troops, ground troops, whatever, and that's going to solve the problem. But I think the question, though, is legitimate. Is ISIS winning? And it depends on what you describe as winning. They seem to be winning some battles. We don't seem to be winning much when it comes to watching our finances or enhancing our safety and our security. We might be able to win a military fight here and there, but really, who's winning and who's losing? So there are other ways to think about this other than just marching in. And recently, Michael Sawyer wrote a sort of an article about this and describing some of the problems quite a bit different than the approach that Donald Trump has.
Indeed, and we put this up on the Institute's website this morning. Mike Sawyer, who's on the board of our Institute, he pointed out that this law and order approach doesn't work and hasn't worked. And we know the U.S. intelligence has said after a year of bombing, they've really made no headway against ISIS. They've made no real significant gains, despite what's being said. And Mike Sawyer points out that really it is the U.S. interventionist policies, the bombings themselves, the drone attacks themselves, which are strengthening ISIS. And in fact, the U.S. building a coalition of moderate Arab states, I don't know if you'd call Saudi Arabia moderate, but building this anti-ISIS coalition actually will have the opposite effect and will encourage them and be a great recruiting tool for them.
And unite the Sunni groups. And already I think that's been said, that there's one thing that unifies all the groups in Syria, and that is get rid of the foreigners. And therefore, and he's arguing this case. But he also complains that we're taking it country by country and don't have a unified policy. And he says it's a mistake for the United States government, and we hear it all the time. This is a long war, be prepared. And I think that might be psychological conditioning for the American people to be prepared for an authoritarian government. But he says that's a serious mistake, because maybe, just maybe, ISIS is moving a lot quicker.
Well, there's the danger of someone like Donald Trump, who's a sort of he's a populist demagogue. He doesn't operate with an ideological or philosophical perspectives guiding him. Unfortunately, he adopts the neocon view that we need troops, but there's no real guiding force, so he doesn't really have a guiding principle. It's a sort of off the cuff. And it's ironic on something like ISIS, where his plan would make things worse, as Mike Sawyer and people who know a lot more about it would say. In some areas, for example, we talked about it earlier with Crimea, he said, hey, that's Europe's problem, it's not our problem.
Yeah, and let's just refresh our memories on Sure. He isn't somebody that's just a journalist speaking out with a little bit of experience, but how many years was he in the CIA, and somebody who's very knowledgeable about this area?
Well, he was head of the unit that was going after bin Laden, so he probably knows more than anyone. In fact, he wrote a book about bin Laden, so he...
Yeah, that is for sure. But he claims that they've made some beachheads in various countries, and he mentions the Balkans, Libya, as well as Afghanistan, but I'd probably add Iraq in there too. There's beachheads for Al-Qaeda / ISIS, so it just seems like they're much further ahead ever since we've been in there, and we go into these countries that are not even there. By the time we leave, they have a presence there.
We talked about this before. The Balkans is very interesting. As I mentioned, I spent a lot of time overseas. I lived there for quite a number of years, and I used to go to Albania very often in work I was doing with the Human Rights Group while there was unrest. And I was shocked because the Albanians are not religious people at all. They've not been for a number of reasons. But all of a sudden, around 97 or 98, every time I flew into Tirana, I would see a shiny new mosque in the countryside. And I asked one of my Albanian partners about it, and he said, "Oh, those are all being built by Saudi Arabia," and they were unhappy. They're madrasas, and they didn't like it because it was stirring things up.
Well, you know, and Michael makes another point that shouldn't be ignored if we're going to be continuing this fight rather than coming up with a sensible foreign policy. He mentions about the strategic naval passageways like the southern part of the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, and the Straits of Malacca in Malaysia. So these are areas, if he said they have a presence there and they can do something and maybe close these down, so strategically they may have bigger plans. But I still think it goes back to where does the motivation come from, and certainly our foreign policy has been a strong motivation. But I'm afraid the Trump approach could become very popular with a lot of Republicans, although the Republicans are cautious. But he was claiming that, yeah, we got to go in. You know, ISIS have killed Christians, which is absolutely true. But you can't say, except on a program like this, but you couldn't say this on TV because they say, well, yes, that is true, and they're evil and they're monsters. That's why we should never do anything to help them. Of course, we had a program pointing out how we helped ISIS get started, and they still have a lot of our weapons. But yes, they have killed Christians. But that's more likely to happen after we get involved. Countries live with, Muslims have lived with Christians and Jews and Muslims when outsiders are not in there. And all of a sudden when the outsiders are there, and I was just thinking about, there's no way the numbers could be, we could grab hold of the numbers, but there's a lot. Think of back from 1991 with the Persian Gulf War. And remember, I think it was Bush one of those times. This is going to be a crusade, which is a reminder of the West Christian nations going in and interfering. But I wonder how many Muslims have been killed in the last 15, 20 years. It has to be a whole lot. So yes, it's all tragic, but I just wish people would think more about what is the precipitating event that causes this, and I think we're a long way from coming up with an answer for that.
Well, whoever thought up the idea of beheadings and putting them on videos was a brilliant media person because the effect is so startling. Everyone is shocked and startled. But you're no less dead when you're an innocent family hit by a drone. You know, the effects are the same. But you touched on something earlier about U.S. Americans getting behind this idea of just go in. And there is a real sense of frustration. There's a lack of understanding about the Arab and Muslim world, and people aren't that interested in looking into it. And I think there's a tendency then to support throwing up our arms and going all in. You know, I noticed something on the debate, I haven't asked you about this before, but it really struck me, is Ted Cruz was up there, and he said something like, we need a field marshal like Sisi to guide us. And he's an absolute military dictator of Egypt. He's assassinated thousands and thousands of his own people and repressing all political thought in the country. And to embrace someone like that is shocking.
Well, and a real problem there, because I've been on the receiving end of it. When you make a suggestion and try to bring common sense to it, that means you're not supporting the troops, you're not American, you're un-American and weak. At the same time, it's because they ignore, out of their willingness to just march on, their willingness to avoid even thinking about how wars are supposed to be started, you know, with the consent of the people and the Congress voting on it. So they just continue to do this. But there was another thing in the news today that I think shows that things are accelerating over there, and that has to do with, of course, the issue we've talked about a lot, and that is what's going on in Turkey. And a couple of weeks ago, it was announced the U.S. and Turkey would, start bombing ISIS and the Kurds. And now today, evidently, there is a reaction to that action. And there were 4 significant violent episodes in Turkey. And I keep thinking, get your opinion on this. I keep thinking, you know, Turkey has their region. They're strong. They're independent. Part of NATO. They don't like Assad. But how far would they have gone with this bombing feeling if we weren't there to encourage them. They might have been a little bit more conservative, but you know, they see this as a chance. We don't like Assad. Now the Americans don't like Assad, and the other Arab nations, Israel doesn't like Assad, so this is the time to do it. It seems like what we do seems to expand the violence with no end in sight. That's what bothers me.
And without getting into conspiracy thinking, it does make you wonder. There are so many stories about the alleged shipment of weapons from places like Benghazi in Libya, where there were so many weapons floating around after our liberation. These being shipped to fighters in Syria via Turkey and Jordan. How much truth is there to that? And maybe what were the Turks promised by the U.S. in exchange for turning a blind eye?
Well, maybe when they interview Hillary on a debate, if there's a debate, maybe she'll explain that to me. Maybe she has some information, you know, about this, but who knows? The American people certainly deserve it. And this is the other thing that bothers me about Trump, because we want information. So if he has all these answers, wouldn't it be good to have the correct information? But what does he do with the guy that finally gives us information? He calls him a traitor. Of course, I'm talking about Edward Snowden. So that's hardly the way to go. I don't believe that there's anything that indicates that Donald Trump wouldn't use executive orders for various domestic things, but for military things too. You know, if Bush did it, and Obama does it, and they ignore what the Congress does, I would think that Donald Trump would be quite willing to use this authoritarian approach, and he really would have made Bill Kristol very happy with the statement he made today about just, you know, boots on the ground and let's go in there and kill them, you know, this sort of thing.
Well, Sawyer provides the real answer, the real solution to the problem. If I can read just his last sentence, because it could have been written by someone I know. It's time to put America first and return to General Washington's foreign policy legacy by immediately proclaiming the end of U.S. interventionism, the termination of support for all states and groups in the Middle East, U.S. withdrawal from NATO, and resumption of America's most effective national security policy, strict neutrality.
You know, that does sound a little bit familiar. Sounds like I can agree with that. And I think a lot of Americans agree with that, because when I talked this language in the campaign, we got a lot of support. But, you know, the war propagandists are run by the media, and by the military-industrial complex, and by just about anybody that gets into the higher echelons of government, and they are the warmongers it's very hard to contend with. But most Americans realize that we'd be better off not doing this, but they can be talked into it because of the old technique. If you don't go along with it, you're un-American, you're weak, and you're unpatriotic. And that has to change. And unfortunately, though, the way we're going now, it's going to stay the same. I think it'll end, though. Unfortunately, it's going to end with a major bankruptcy. That's why the economic conditions are very vital. The Chinese are buying less of our currency right now, and interest rates essentially will go up. We're going to have a major crisis come, and it's going to be mixed in. We will back off. The Soviet system collapsed for economic reasons, not for military reasons. Fortunately, we never had to even think about fighting a nuclear war with the Soviets, and therefore this will end, and it will end with us ending up being much weaker. The one thing that we must retain is the understanding and the principles that once were understood by Americans, and that is the principles of liberty. If we retain that, we can remain a great country and a valuable country, but we won't be the bully of the world. We won't be telling other people how to live and what to do, interfering and precipitating so many problems. That is the world that I would like to see. That is the world I'm sure if the American people had a real vote on this, would know exactly where they stood. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.